Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States. He is often celebrated for his progressive reforms and his role in shaping the League of Nations. Yet his presidency also left a darker legacy, marked by deep racial regression. While Wilson championed economic progress and reform, his administration amplified segregation, embodied white supremacist movements, and fueled racial violence. My essay here explores Wilson's impact on racial progress in America by examining both his presidency, his racist policies, cultural influence such as the birth of a nation, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the violence of the Red Summer of 1919. With the sources that I've collected and examined, my thesis that I will be defending is that Woodrow Wilson caused more bad than good during the course of his presidency. But first, a bit of background. Before the Wilson administration, racial progress in the United States was marked by a complex, uneasy journey. The Reconstruction era, post the Lincoln assassination, which is 1867 to 1877 roughly, saw significant strides for minorities. With the abolition of slavery, and by minorities I mean African American men, with the abolition of slavery and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which collectively abolished slavery, granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and protected voting rights for Black African Americans. These advances, however, were met with fierce resistance all around the country. During Reconstruction, Black Americans made remarkable gains. Freedmen schools educated thousands. Black politicians such as Hiram Reveals and Blanche Bruce were elected to Congress. African Americans built institutions like churches and mutual aid societies, leading to economic and cultural progress and resilience. However, progress was derailed by the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow laws in the 19th century. The federal government retreated from enforcing civil rights, allowing southern states to implement segregation and put down black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. The Supreme Court's decision in the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896 upheld the decision that separate but equal is equal, thus leading to racial discrimination all across the country. Despite these horrible setbacks, figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerged, advocating for education, economic progress, and civil rights, laying the groundwork for future racial justice movements and advocates like MLK and Malcolm X. Progress before Wilson's presidency was thus significant, but was fought with regression and struggle. Woodrow Wilson came to power in 1913 when he was elected the 28th president. Promising sweeping reforms as a part of his new freedom platform, many Black Americans were optimistic, and he was often hailed as the second coming of Lincoln. However, his Southern upbringing and belief in the lost cause myth, for those who are unfamiliar, the lost cause myth is the idea that the Confederacy is noble and superior and that African Americans were inferior. His Southern upbringing shaped his racial views. Before Wilson, the Reconstruction era had brought constitutional amendments granting Black American citizenships and voting rights. But the rise of Jim Crow laws after 1877 stripped these gains away. By the early 20th century, Black leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were fighting for progress, but Wilson's presidency would deal their efforts a significant blow. The first piece to talk about Wilson's race relations would have to be his presidential inaugural address. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson, on his presidential address, revealed complex and often contradictory views on race and equality. We can see this, for example, during his Independence Hall speech, when Wilson emphasized that America was a champion country of human rights, stating that the United States was founded to, quote, vindicate the rights of men, end quote, and that it did not originally discriminate by race. He claimed America's purpose was to extend freedom and opportunity universally, and you would think that would mean everybody. But his administration's policies contradicted these ideals to the max, as he supported federal segregation and excluded Black Americans from millions and millions of... Not millions. But his administration's policies often contradicted these ideals, as he supported federal segregation and excluded black Americans from many opportunities during his presidency. Once in office, Wilson approved the segregation of federal workplaces, forcing black employees into separate spaces and dismissing them from many positions. He justified this as reducing friction and would create less racism, but you can see the irony in that, I would hope. By doing this, instead of causing less friction and tension between black and white government workers, he effectively rolled back years of integration. Wilson also appointed racists to key federal roles, ensuring that systemic discrimination persisted. An important black figure who often flies under the radar was William Monroe Trotter. He was a prominent African-American activist and confronted Woodrow Wilson in November 1914 in the White House. He came to confront him over his administration's implication of racial segregation, which we had just previously talked about. Trotter, representing the National Independent Political League, criticized Wilson for betraying his campaign promises of racial equality, labeling segregation as unjust and a step backward for the democracy. This meeting was tense, with Trotter's assertive tone angering Wilson, who defended segregation as a method to reduce workplace friction. Wilson accused Trotter of being disrespectful and dismissed his arguments. Ultimately, the meeting ended without resolution, and Wilson reaffirmed his stance on segregation. Trotter took the issue to the press, publicly condemning Wilson's policies, though the encounter failed to reverse segregation. It symbolized the rising challenge to institutional racism and highlighted the moral urgency of civil rights advocacy during the 20th century. The next important piece of information is a seminal American film called The Birth of a Nation, released in 1915. Directed by D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation is a silent film that became one of the most influential and controversial works in American cinema. The movie portrays the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, focusing on two families, the Northern Stonemans and the Southern Camerons. It romanticizes the Confederacy and the antebellum South, depicting Southern life as idyllic before the war, and that Reconstruction was rather a period of chaos and corruption. The film's second half portrays African Americans played by white actors in blackface as dangerous and immoral, while glorifying the Ku Klux Klan as heroic saviors that restore order. A necessary reason to understand why the Klan was revitalized with The Birth of a Nation we can find in one of my secondary sources, by Melvin Stokes, a book called The Most Controversial Motion Picture of All Time, The Birth of a Nation. He writes that one crucial reason for the appeal of the Griffith film to audiences of 1915 was that it raised issues and took positions that were of relevance to such audience. There was many folks just like Woodrow Wilson, who grew up in the antebellum South and were big fans of the Lost Cause myth. Melvin Stokes is saying right here that this speaks to them, and that many of the people living down south found this movie to be representative of their views, thus leading to the popularity and the revitalization of the Klan. The Klan is depicted rescuing a white woman and reestablishing white supremacy. Praised for its groundbreaking cinematic techniques, including innovative editing and large-scale battle scenes, the film was equally condemned, and rightfully so, for its blatant racism. It sparked protests and helped revive the Klan all across the country, leaving a horrible legacy. The important part of this film is that Wilson praised it, describing it like, quote, history written with lightning, end quote. The film's success helped revive the Klan, as previously stated. It's also important to denote that it not only targeted African Americans, but also immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. Wilson's silence on the Klan's resurgence only emboldened its influence and return. We can see with such a seminal film like this, and Wilson refusing to condemn it, how that could put us back many years racially. And still to this day, The Birth of a Nation and his inability to condemn the revitalization of the Ku Klux Klan will forever loom over the legacy of his presidency. An important reaction that we should take note of is that not every politician was for the birth of a nation. For example, the mayor of New York City, published in an interview in The Sun in 1915, believed that it was unjust and put down 10 million black citizens in America. It is also important to notice that this film was banned in over 40 theaters across the country, and that Woodrow Wilson liking it really can show you how he was going against the grain, per se. Another thing that supports my thesis of that before I get to my remaining sources, I'd like to start with one of my secondary sources. The secondary source that I picked for one of two was a video called Woodrow Wilson, the Divisive Democrat. Now, although this video didn't focus on many of the racial aspects of Woodrow Wilson's presidency that I chose to fix on, it made a great point that I think is important to bring up in the video. Is that Woodrow Wilson is often considered one of the most pre-FDR liberal presidents. And as such, you would think that he would have been a president for everyone. But this is not true. Woodrow Wilson was a president for the whites, the white rich people, not the African Americans. Unlike his successors, Woodrow Wilson did nothing for racial progress in America. And so far, our sources have shown us that instead of rather doing nothing or making no progress, he instead turned us back in time. Another primary source that I would like to bring up that shows us how we made no racial progress in America during the Woodrow Wilson presidency is a letter from W.E.B. Du Bois. In January 3rd, 1914, Du Bois wrote to Wilson criticizing his policies and that the inaction would embolden segregationists. He argued, W.E.B. said, "The result of your administration thus far is that every enemy of the Negro race is greatly encouraged." End quote. Du Bois expressed concern that Wilson's policies had given Southern segregationists such as Vardaman and Tillman, who were two very important Southern segregationist senators, a hope for return to racial oppression, a time before 1865 and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Du Bois called for a more active commitment to racial equality. He challenged Wilson to fulfill his campaign promises to support civil rights and truly embody Abraham Lincoln, who his counterparts and peers had called him the second coming of. This letter from W.E.B. Du Bois supports my thesis in that instead of making progress for racial equality during the Wilson era, we instead turned back the clock for African Americans. Wilson's inability to hold his campaign promises did nothing but snub black people and hold them back and African Americans for their future. The racial tensions that fostered and brewed during Wilson's presidency finally erupted in the Red Summer of 1919, when violent mobs attacked black communities all across the country, many of them returning black veterans who had fought for democracy abroad. They demanded just equality at home, which sparked violent backlash for racists across the country. Wilson's administration did little to address the violence. Instead, they just addressed problems in other countries, such as Germany. This reflects our broader failure during the Wilson administration to confront white supremacy. These events highlighted the systemic racism that Wilson's policies had enforced and marked a turning point in the civil rights struggle. Lastly, I'd like to look at Woodrow Wilson's address on the subject of mob violence. Quote, "I allude to the mob spirit which has recently here and there very frequently shown its head amongst us, not in any single region, but in many and widely separated parts of the country. There have been many lynchings, and every one of them has been a blow to heart at ordered law and humane justice. No man who loves America, no man who really cares for her flame and honor and character, or is truly loyal to her institutions can justify mob action while the courts of justice are open and the government of the states of the nation are ready and able to do their duty. We at this very moment are fighting lawless passion." End quote. On the surface level, it appears that Woodrow Wilson is denouncing the racism and the mob violence. But if we truly look into it, he refuses to acknowledge the people that are suffering at the hands of these violence, and that his inability to support racial equality and progress in America is the reason that these mob violence, these mob lynchings, and that this mob violence are happening. Finally, the conclusion. Woodrow Wilson's presidency was marked by harmful racial policies that reinforced segregation and inequality. Wilson's approval and belovement of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation in 1915, a film that praised the Klan and portrayed black Americans negatively and reinforced stereotypes, helped revive white supremacy. In 1919, the Red Summer saw violent attacks on black Americans as racial tensions exploded across the country. W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading African-American civil rights activist, grew increasingly frustrated with Wilson's actions. He had initially supported Wilson, but became disillusioned as the president's policies, such as segregating federal offices, fueled racial division. The Klan's comeback during this time, partly due to the film Birth of a Nation, highlighted the growing danger of racial hatred and underscored the struggle for black equality. The period reflects a dark chapter in American history as the fight for civil rights faced fierce opposition from both the government and hate groups. And that is why I believe that Woodrow Wilson's presidency did more harm than good to racial progress in the United States.